Thank you, Prabhu. It really is a great honor for me to speak at this inaugural policy seminar of TARINA. And I actually happened to be in Cornell in Ithaca, actually when TCI was awarded this grant. So it's great to be here and in front of such a distinguished audience and along with my distinguished panelists. A lot of what I had planned to talk about in terms of the agricultural diversification and implications for nutrition have already been sort of mentioned, alluded to in some way or the other by my previous panelists, Purvi as well as Suresh. So let me just focus on a few key issues that I think are really important as far as India being able to double farmers' incomes, as well as improve our anthropometric outcomes, which are among the worst in the world, and what agricultural diversification has to do with all of this. So I think I'd like to start off first with really talking about the urbanization challenge that we face and what that has done for changing dietary preferences. I think India's urban transition is really part of a once-in-history phenomenon. 2011 was the first time in history that 50% of the world actually lived in cities. India is currently 31% urbanized, and this is going to rise to 50% in the next 2 decades. 65% of India's growth in GDP actually came from urban areas between 1999 and 2010. So all of this increasing urbanization has had a significant impact on changing consumer preferences, dietary patterns that Purvi alluded to earlier. And if you look at some of the granular data from the 5 NSS quinquennial surveys over the last 15 years, you can really see these dietary shifts and the fact that high-value foods now occupy sort of a much higher share of overall food expenditure compared to what we saw 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So what does this imply for agricultural diversification? What we normally see is that when consumers move away from traditional staples towards more diversified diets and high-value foods such as fresh fruits and vegetables, animal proteins that were alluded to also earlier, this in turn really sort of creates demand and growth in post-harvest management services such as sorting, grading, cold storage, etc. This creates more employment in manufacturing and services sector, some of which would be in urban areas, but also in secondary cities, peri-urban areas, where you have workers and their families also demanding foods that are easy to prepare or easy to eat because the value of their time is higher than in cooking for family. So again, this leads again to increased demand in food services and so on. So, and this, of course, creates, more growth in employment. Every 10%, of course, growth in food processing in the organized sector results in employment growth of 5%. But what happens is that what we have been seeing, since the post-Green Revolution period, is that this is not really sort of happening to the extent that that should have happened in India. And, Prabhu and I have been working on a paper looking at some of these policies that, might have really sort of, created what is called a cereals fundamentalism, and where this has resulted in some diversification into higher value crops across the country, but the pace has been extremely slow and uneven. And granted, as Suresh said, you can't have diversification everywhere. Maybe the diversification will only happen much more in the rain-fed areas, more in the south and the east, rather than sort of the northwest part of India. But we, I think what we feel is that there have been a lot of policies put in place that, it's probably time to dismantle now, slowly, with, of course, the right safety net measures in place, that will really create a much more neutral set of policies sort of going forward. I won't talk a whole lot about the food grain management policies. As you know, the MSP has effectively become sort of the floor price in the major production areas. And this has resulted in a place like Punjab really becoming, which occupies only less than 2% of the geographical area, but contributes more than 50% of the grain to the central grain pool. And of course, what is not sort of realized, or which is probably less sort of commented on, is the huge impact this has on sustainability, and the whole issue of the falling water tables in Punjab is now well known. And here diversification into, say, maize or cotton, pulses and fruits and vegetables are possible. This will not happen unless we have an assured relative profitability vis-a-vis rice wheat through much more neutral price policies, which I'm sure Ashok will talk about, along with, of course, a combination of incentives such as state-backed infrastructure to facilitate marketing. Marketing, of course, has been and associated reforms, and the policies associated with marketing, such as the ECA that has prevented the creation of a national integrated market, are quite well known to this audience, I'm sure. But basically, the historical regulatory environment of the APMC Act has really created these long value chains that has created information barriers, encouraged spot markets, and discouraged vertical coordination, all of which have stifled investments in post-harvest management and agribusiness. So another implication of this is that demand signals from consumers, which we are seeing, would have to be passed along many actors before it actually reaches the farmer. And this long value chain also tends to drop information along the way and discourages contracting between farmers and agribusinesses, and also other forms of vertical coordination. Suresh also talked about sort of the FDI. Again, we've had a lot of uncertainties and ambiguities in this area. And the retailing of primary and processed agriculture is about a $650 billion industry in India, but the modern format retailing only accounts for about 10% at present. And from a policy point of view, the healthy development and growth of retailing is essential, given its strong impact, particularly on population of the consumers across social and economic strata, large numbers of individual and small-scale suppliers, given that over 65% of farmers in India are either small or marginal farmers, and given that food comprises almost 60% of all retailing activity. So a significant proportion of these suppliers are eventually the smallholder farmers, so there are significant equity implications here too. So the employment generation that we can derive from freeing up I think the constraints in this sector is tremendous. I won't mention the potato example here again, but I do want to talk about a little bit about the lessons that we can draw from establishing modern fronts with backward linkages and what we saw in food processing. For example, India allowed 100% FDI in agro-food processing in 1991, and these reforms increased the supply of capital to the agro-processing sector and led to increased investments. And there's been a lot of, I worked in Indonesia before coming to India, and there was a huge, it's always been a huge issue that FDI is going to displace the smaller retail and so on. But what we've seen in India is that there's no evidence that FDI in agro-processing actually displaced the unorganized agro-processing segment, because this segment has remained a large part of the sector, with gross value added almost at par with the organized segment. And it employs more people, approximately 25 million people, compared to only 5.5 million in the organized sector. So I think the solution really is in developing much more inclusive models of modern food retailing that include the unorganized segment, maybe perhaps more in a pilot mode, but then that requires partnerships with entities that have both knowledge as well as cheaper cost of capital. I also want to talk a little bit about, I think one of the other factors that has really limited diversification has really been sort of the limited and R&D, because technology, again, is key to really sort of a further growth in the sector. Productivity, we still have major yield gaps, and although our absolute levels of R&D expenditure are still high, it's still very much biased towards the staple crops. And we really need a much more agile, climate-smart agricultural research and technology system, which also needs to emphasize varieties that are capable of withstanding specific growing conditions, and also varieties that are specifically suited to the needs of crop livestock systems, again, with implications for nutrition, also agro-processors. And this is going to be an increasing demand, and what my earlier colleague has talked about, the importance of revamping agricultural university curricula to really sort of reflect this will also be extremely important. So, I mean, just to conclude, I think the government objectives in terms of the Green Revolution, objectives in terms of maintaining food security for a large country, it was completely legitimate, I think, in the past. But these policies are now really sort of mitigating against, really proving a disincentive for farmers to really respond to market signals. Reducing yield gaps maybe in other states would also eliminate the need to produce any rice, for example, in the major water-stressed states such as Punjab, Haryana, or Maharashtra. So I think modernizing agriculture also through a refocusing of the research is going to be extremely important. The huge potential for post-harvest food management, as I mentioned earlier, there's been explosive urban and rural non-farm demand. These consumers want different, more convenient, safer, and nutritious foods. And the rural non-farm employment is a major source of jobs, and what we've seen is there's a strong correlation with agricultural productivity across countries and even within India, across states. Rural non-farm employment now accounts for more than all urban employment, about 300 million. So I think in conclusion, I think what we're looking for is a food system that provides food to meet higher and shifting composition of demand, raises the income of the poor, farm labor productivity and access to markets, and increases jobs in agribusinesses, improves nutritional outcomes, but these really have to be achieved with the existing natural resource base in a much more climate smart way. I think that's something that gets less attention. I think we all know about the costly approach in terms of the over $60 billion in subsidies, in terms of the fiscal impact, but in terms of the implications for sustainability and growth, I think that's much less appreciated because it really compromises productivity and resilience in the long term, creating water and soil problems. We're seeing this all over the place. And there are, of course, options for achieving these objectives much more efficiently through cash transfers and the like. And to really sort of realign expenditures for much greater and more sustainable impact on core objectives, but also creating a level playing field that is neutral, I think, across commodities, I think is the first step towards improving diversification and as Purvi said, to really promote a much more nutrition-sensitive agricultural policy framework that will remove distortions and stimulate investments that respond to market signals. Thank you.